Could you give me one of those? So you guys want to text.
All right. Good morning, members of the council. So this morning we are going to have a somewhat different session than we had yesterday. We're going to have a panel session, and what I'm going to aim to do is give everybody a kind of a foundation of knowledge on some of the background parts of Part 5, since not all of you council members were here when we went through this process originally. Keeping in mind, though, that we did hear from Steve Shipsey, David Allen, David Yamamoto during our OPAC meeting following the Court of Appeals decision. So I'm happy today that we have a number of different voices that can talk about the process, but also provide a perspective on moving forward. Good morning, David. Great. We are just starting things. So David Allen will be the first speaker after myself, followed by David Fox, who's going to talk about the development of kind of the review standards that are present in Part 5, followed by Jason Bush, who's going to provide the marine industry perspective, and then Dan Helene, which is going to provide kind of the industry/research perspective. So my goal today is really to give you that broad overview of Part 5 so that we have a foundation for our discussion today, and cover some of the details that are going to be relevant for our discussion. This is one of those microphones that you have to really be. So, Part 5, and when it was completed in 2013 and adopted before the Court of Appeals decision, had three main components that all worked together to form the plan and to work together as a system. The first of which was the Part 5 chapter. This was the text that established our policies, our standards. I'll go through a little bit about what's in there. We then had the plan map and designations and area designations. So this was, these were referenced in the text of Part 5, but they are necessary for the implementation of Part 5 because they provide the spatial framework for decision making. And then finally there was this large effort to produce resource inventory information that the plan was built with. Basically, it was the foundation of the spatial framework. So now this, for you members who weren't on the council and participating, this was a 5-year process with over 100 public meetings conducted by primarily 3 different working groups. The Ocean Policy Advisory Council was one of the main drivers of this. They established a territorial sea plan working group to take the lead, which developed some initial recommendations, worked a lot on the resource inventory information, and the and required pieces of knowledge, and a lot of the public outreach was done by that group. And then OPAC kind of sent some recommendations to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, TESPAC, which was established at the kind of request or on the recommendation of the OPAC for the addition of an industry perspective to a rulemaking group that basically was going to be potentially impacted by the amended rules. So this was a very complicated and long process. It involved multiple parties. But in the end, we felt that it produced a framework that was very comprehensive in nature, and barring a few differences that existed between the OPAC recommendation and the TESPAC recommendation, there was a lot of agreement upon. You see here the main heading of what's in the text chapter of Part 5. You can see it includes everything from background and general policies related to the development of marine renewable energy industry, the implementation requirements for both state waters with some acknowledgement about federal waters planning. It provided a state agency review process, which they named the JART, Joint Agency Review Team. And it provided the resource and use inventory and effects evaluation and special resource and use review standards. So this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of the review of any proposed project. And after my presentations yesterday, you should begin to see some parallels in the structure of Part 5 with the structure of Part 2. So in many ways, what was produced under Part 5 was a customized version of Part 2 specifically for the topic or the use of marine renewable energy. We also developed some application requirements. So just like the cables process in Territorial Sea Plan Part 4, we require a pre-application meeting where an applicant can come and sit down and talk with the agencies and get an understanding of what they're going to be asked during the review process for the permit. And that includes some financial capacity demonstrations and an application fee. Right, so there's a better understanding if you are a developer of what would be expected of you when you walk through the door. There's also a detailed list of kind of what we as a state would like to see when we are provided with operational plans for the proposed action. And that includes a phase development plan, a facility development plan, a project operation plan, decommissioning plan, a financial assurance plan, and then finally the last, or the second to last section covers the fact that we have a nationally renowned research center, what was the Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center, which is now the Pacific Marine Energy Center, PMEC, and that they had a test site on the north side of Yaquina Head, a very small, not grid connected location where they could test non-grid connected sites. And so there was a specific call out to that entity, recognizing that one of the priorities for the state was to promote the research and development of these technologies. Finally, there was a section that added some criteria for when the plan would be reviewed. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of the broad structure of Part 5, what's in the plan itself. You have as a handout in your materials the black line copy, Part 5. We'll get to that later. but that's the real text. So if you're curious about any one of these sections, that's where you would find what's in there. So we all know we talked about the Court of Appeals decision and that it invalidated the 2013 amendments. As already discussed this morning, we as an agency do have a desire to readopt Part 5, to recommence the process. And it's important to note that there is a 2009 version of Part 5. It was not submitted to NOAA for enforceable policies, but it is currently the state policy on this. And it does not include the plan map and area designations or the sections of Part 5 that specifically describe the review process, the inventory and effects evaluation process, the review standards, or the plan review. So the other sections of Part 5 are still what's active today. Now I want to step back because I want to explain the plan framework to you all. And one of the key messages in doing so is, again, this took a long time. There was a lot of work. Like what Charlie and I suggested yesterday for a phased process, the Part 5 process happened in kind of two general phases, and that's where the 2009 version comes in. And that's where there was a lot of the language that was developed initially. And we were under an executive order and a duty to complete the first version of the plan in a year based upon that initial executive order. The phase 2 of the process can really be characterized as the development of the resource inventory and the standards. And we spent a lot of time, we worked with a lot of groups, including local port groups, OCZMA, the Wave Energy Trust, Eco Trust, and other local interest groups to evaluate, we presented the information that we had, we got comments about the sufficiency of our information, and all of those things were used to put together the draft plan, which was then passed to TestPac and then to my commission. So I want to go a little bit more in depth into the spatial framework part of this process. And if you think about any one particular resource, data layer, or set of information, we try to have complete data sets for the entire territorial system. So our kelp information as an example, we have multiple years of kelp surveys. They were all kind of aggregated, summarized into a single statewide summary layer. But then when we needed to kind of combine those with other resource inventory information, we used a planning grid. So we kind of laid out a regular set of grids, cells, that were all kind of the same size and shape, that covered the territorial sea, and we associated resources and uses with those areas. And then we looked at Goal 19 and the text of Goal 19, specifically the areas of biological and ecological importance, the areas of importance to fisheries, and the existing uses or areas for special management. And we summarized those layers together. We determined which resources fell into which category, whether or not they deserved kind of high levels of protection or not. We then kind of added all those things together as kind of a picture of the existing uses and resources that would be covered by Goal 19, which would then give us a picture of kind of other opportunity areas for the development of the industry, given that we had a lot of uncertainty about what the kinds of technologies would be, what the impacts of those technologies would be to those resources. Right, so there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of work, and I think Jason can talk about the technology curve for marine renewable energy devices in general. When you look at an industry like wind energy industry, it took a long time for the kind of optimization of wind turbine shape to form. the same kind of technology development curve is happening here, and I think we're still kind of in the early part of that, but I'll let Jason correct me if that's not correct. And while we were doing that, we had a lot of reviews, specifically with OPAC and with OPAC's working groups. So it's important to recognize that that part of the process, the resource inventory development process, had a lot of attention and a lot of support. And it ended up with our spatial framework, or the plan map areas and designations. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this graphic since it's important to explain the different kinds of areas relative to kind of the standards for development. On the left side of this graphic, it's kind of a higher bar to meet whether or not a permit will be approved, given an evaluation of the proposal against kind of the identified resources and uses. Right. So the area names that we generated are up at the top of this. On the left side, it's harder again, so it's kind of a ratcheted system. But we should recognize that there's a complete sweep from places that we are proposing that it's not appropriate for a development of renewable energy versus on the other end of the spectrum, places that already have a renewable energy permit area associated with them. Right, so the other category that's maybe a little bit different is this proprietary use and management areas. These are areas within the territorial sea where there was already kind of an authorized user of an area. The cables were an excellent example of this, where DSL had, the cable companies have a lease through DSL, and therefore kind of a first right to use that space. And then when you go down into kind of the other broad areas, you have a resources and uses conservation area, which is kind of the highest standard, but still acceptable for development if they can meet the benchmarks of kind of no reasonably foreseeable adverse effects. Then you have a resources and uses management area, or a RUMA, and these are areas that have kind of less identified discrete resources and or uses, so ecological resources and or fishery resources. It's kind of a more diffuse concentration of them in the resources and uses management area. And the standard is slightly lower for review on those. And then finally, the Renewable Energy Facility Suitability Study Area. Thank you, Rick Williams, for that moniker. Areas, and this is where kind of the lowest areas of conflict, the lowest number of identified resources and uses existed within the territorial sea. So that's a broad summary of the different kind of map areas relative to their kind of level of difficulty from the development perspective to get a permit. On top of that, we had two overlays, and we heard a lot of public testimony, a lot of public comment about the importance of marine recreation, but also the importance of the aesthetic resources, the visual resources that are out there. And so we as an agency spent a lot of time and energy developing a visual resources management system, one of the first in the nation for the ocean, and which applies broadly to the entire coast, and there are standards associated with the quality of a view shed related to the potential for development in that area. And then the recreation area overlay as well existed over the entire territorial sea, and there were standards developed for that area. So that's the broad kind of plan map framework system that was put together. If you look at kind of a standards matrix for basically what review standards applied in a specific area. Here you see on the left the area type. So the exclusion area, there's no kind of standards applied because no applications will be accepted within that area. The proprietary and use management area, there are standards related to the underlying identification of data and resources, but there is almost a presumed exclusion from this area unless there's compatibility amongst those uses. We'll probably talk about these areas a bit later relative to the subject of undersea cables. That's one of the things that was flagged by OPAC in its recommendations. And then you can see that the resources and use conservation area, management area, and suitability study areas, kind of the applicability of the standards goes down the closer you get to the bottom of the matrix. So now just a brief kind of summary of those particular areas as it was in the 2013 plan. So what was included in the renewable energy exclusion areas in the 2013 adopted version were the dredge material disposal sites and the state designated marine managed areas, which includes the marine reserves and protected areas. So those were the two resource layers that were identified in the exclusion area. The next area included the proprietary and use management areas. The resource inventory layers there included the shipping lanes, coastal discharge outfalls, wildlife refuges, research cables, ocean outfalls, and pilotage areas. So there were already kind of an authorized or an existing use for those in this location. The resources and use conservation area included a lot of the natural resources that could be described in kind of a discrete way, so that we had a firm understanding of the boundary of these locations. And Dave will talk a little bit more about kind of how the data was used and developed and used to produce review standards. But here you have things like areas of greatest importance to fisheries, ocean recreation hotspots, kelp beds, subtidal rocky reefs, rocky shores, pinniped haulouts, critical habitats for things like stellar sea lion, nesting seabird colonies, and ecological hotspots that were identified using kind of a state analysis with a MarkSAN, which was a tool that does basically hotspot analysis. We also had the resource and use management areas then. Again, the standard slightly lower, but it does include areas that were important for oceanographic research. It includes areas that were kind of voluntary agreements like the crabber tugboat agreement, gray whale foraging areas, marbled murrelet foraging areas, kind of lesser hotspots identified through ecological analysis, and then again areas of importance to fisheries. Now there's a greatest, which was in the conservation area and or great. I remember having that discussion when we were going through there as to what kind of terminology to use. But it's basically the next level of kind of total use of the area by the fishery as provided by our fisheries maps.
And can you clarify what this is down here, the 130, in this case 22?
Oh yeah, so that was the original analysis of the amount of the territorial sea that each of the areas in the plan framework composed. So the next map designation area I want to talk about is the resource and use development area. The acronym and the words there don't match, but it's now the Renewable Energy Facility Suitability Study Area. I think I will remember that for the rest of my life. And that includes places where there were some things that were identified, including like navigational aids. There might have been a dredge material disposal site that had been designated in those locations before. But basically, it was kind of void of those other discrete or other identified natural resources or uses. So it's kind of the lowest conflict areas. And then finally, the renewable energy permit area. This one was really in there for the places where we already had permits that had been grandfathered in due to the process, and OPT fit in this category, as well as the NIMRIC site. So the ocean power technology was there. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. The recreational area overlay, we developed some standards that define significant adverse effects and or what a significant recreational use is. I'm not going to read what those are. And then the visual resource kind of management, or the visual resource overlay, included a planning phase where we went out and completed an inventory that resulted then in standards that would be applied during a regulatory phase. I'm happy to go into more details on this if there's interest. But again, just to summarize, what was adopted in 2013 was this plan set of area designations and standards. So shifting gears now to kind of our pathways for moving forward. You all have my staff report to our commission in front of you as a handout. In that staff report, there is a background and introductory section that details the process that we went through to get to where we are today. But then it also provides an analysis of our alternatives for moving forward with the Part 5 amendment. And these are alternatives that my commission will be considering next week at its meeting here. So Thursday and Friday of next week. And these are based upon the commission receiving kind of the rule back after it was invalidated back from the Court of Appeals. So one option is the commission could decide not to spend any more energy or industry, excuse me, not to spend energy on Part 5 and leave the 2009 version of Part 5 in place if they felt that that was not worth the time and effort. Alternative 2 is the commission could adopt the original OPAC recommendations provided they could make the required statutory and goal findings. Alternative 3, the commission could return what they originally adopted in 2013 back to OPAC as it specified needed revisions. Or alternative 4, the commission could modify the adopted 2013 Part 5 and send those to OPAC as specification of needed revisions. So right now the ball is in LCDC's court. They will be receiving my staff report and making a decision. And this process diagram goes for alternative 3 and 4 listed on the previous slide. So only on alternative 3 and 4 would this process be kind of the guide. And so LCDC, if it decides to return the specified revisions to OPAC, would do so. OPAC would have an opportunity to agree with the specified revisions and send it back to the commission as such, which then the commission would recognize, it would agree, and it would adopt the required revisions and complete the rule amendment. If OPAC received the required revisions and advises other recommendations along with making the required revisions, we would send those to LCDC. So there would be the specified revisions along with other recommendations, and LCDC would be able to review what those recommendations were, and they could, if they agreed with them, agree and adopt the specified revisions as well as the other recommendations. But either way, there's kind of a two-part process where OPAC will receive the Part 5 recommendations back with specified revisions, and then send something back to the commission.
Is there a loop, Andy, if it, on the third box, if they didn't agree, we go back to OPAC and just keep going in a circle, right?
I will let Steve Shipsey answer that question.
I don't want to do worst case scenario, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, that question came up at the time the legislation was being worked on, and the idea was that it was not back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
So in other words, if it goes through us and it goes to the commission, they don't agree, what happens?
I mean, they would adopt specific provisions if there were other recommendations that they didn't agree with, they don't have to go back to OPAC, I understand. But.
Steve, can you
they
speak
could-
up? We can't hear you back here.
Oh,
God. Should cough on that.
Don't do that. I was speaking right into the microphone. There you go. Is it better, Charlie?
It's better.
So, I mean, the idea was that when the legislation was changed, that the idea was it would go back to OPAC. With the specified revisions, OPAC would have an opportunity to make those revisions and suggest other recommendations, but it wasn't a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
It's not an infinite.
So I want to spend a little bit of time detailing our staff recommendation.
Overtime, but.
Yep. First of all, we as a department are recommending changes to the renewable energy facility suitability study areas. The department is going to recommend moving forward with 2 REFSA areas. They were both part of the original Part 5 adoption, and they include Camp Rylea and Lakeside. These 2 sites were the top selected recommendations from TESPAC and OPAC respectively. This alternative incorporates kind of following through on the condition that was placed in the original Part 5, where if OPT, the company that had a permit off of Reedsport, if they abandoned their sites and their plans for their larger footprint of build out, then there was a condition on the plan that that site would revert to whatever it should have been based upon the resource inventory evaluation. So we are following through, we are leaving that site out of the recommendations in this instance. Additionally, we are recommending that the Nestucca site be withdrawn from the recommendation, as it did not have support either really from OPAC or TESPAC upon review. There was also a recommended plan framework change. So we did hear public comment, and there were amicus briefs filed on behalf of the cable companies related to the inclusion of the cable companies in the proprietary and use management areas. There were concerns related to a change in the language where it was dependent upon the authorized user agreeing to the use of that area. And so that language upon review by DOJ was deemed an unconstitutional delegation of authority to somebody other than the state for making a decision within the state lease area. And so we are recommending that we move both undersea fiber optic telecommunications cables and research cables to the renewable energy exclusion areas to avoid the conflicting use proposal in those locations. And then finally, there were a very few proposed text amendments to the 2013 submitted amendments. They are included and highlighted in your formatted black line copy of Part 5. The 2018 amendments are highlighted in yellow with a strike through where there's deletion, and or bolded and included as red if there was an addition. And those changes were made to more closely reflect the OPAC recommendations, including the maximum build out of the area percentage, which was changed from 3 to 2%. The cables, we needed to move the cables in the area designation language and the map designation component. And then we need to rename what is the Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center language in the current version of the plan to reflect the updated name for the Pacific Marine Energy Center organization. So I'm sorry I went over. Here's a summary of your handout copies. And I did provide a couple of extra slides. If you want to relive the glory days and go back to view Marine Map and all of the data layers that were collected, all of the proposals that were brought forward, those things are available from the Oregon Ocean Info site. If you go to the Marine Map item on Oregon Ocean Info, there is a Google Earth file that includes all of the data layers and links to the data layers. So if you have the Google Earth platform on your machine, you can open them up and view all of those. Additionally, you can get all of the resource inventory information from our Coastal Atlas data catalog, and the link is provided to you. And with that, I will conclude. And then I will, you want to bring 2 people up, or you want to bring 4 people up? John?
Yeah, I just want to ask you, is there anyone who has a specific clarification question on something you saw on the slide?
Well, do you redo any of the data layers to incorporate your suggestions so that it's visually represented somewhere? I see that they're just recommendations at this point, but.
Yes, so the map, yeah, so the question is, did we include visually the changes anywhere?
Your recommendation.
The recommendations, yeah, so in the black line copy in front of you, you have the text amendment, the proposed text amendment changes. Now, there's a lot of text amendment changes that are identified in that copy, which were part of the 2013 amendments, the suite of text amendments that went through. And so those things there, I think there were mostly agreement on the language that's in there. So Chris Wall has a question, and she asks, why was the maximum build-out percentage changed, recommended for change in my staff report? We changed it to be closer to the OPAC recommendation, is the simple answer. But we also recognize in the passage of time that amount of build-out is likely appropriate for the amount of interest in the territorial sea in particular. And if you do a calculation of percentage of miles available, I think you're talking about 60 square miles as a 2% benchmark, given the total area of the territorial sea is something like 1,230. I'm not recalling the number off the top of my head. But just to reflect the kind of current status of the driving force in the industry. So hopefully that answers your question, Chris.
All right, thank you, Andy. We'll have a more robust discussion, I'm sure, later. I just wanted to get out any clarification questions. With that, we'll invite David Allen up. Andy, are you suggesting bringing 2 folks up?
Yeah, I was thinking of having.
So that David Fox is.
Yeah, maybe David and I. Dave had some slides, so when he's up, I will change that. Do you want me to have a slide up there for you?
Well,
David?
the only thing, I've sent those 2 attachments.
Okay.
I don't know whether,
You received them.
Yeah.
I really don't have any slides to present
Okay.
unless David does.
I don't.
You wanna go first, David?
It's up to you.
Yeah, one, you know,
Or it's up to, I guess, OPAC.
whatever, I mean, there's four of us, but
I don't think the order necessarily, unless Andy, you feel strongly, I'm not sure the order
I'm
matters. So,
fine either way.
I appreciate that you guys wear matching uniforms.
But
Oh, yeah.
We are matching.
I know you guys are
Wasn't
both
planned.
David and they're both wearing matching outfits. So this
And
is-
same first name.
Yeah.
That's where the similarity is.
So-
Yeah.
But hey, and we
I
both
know.
don't,
Same haircuts, there you go.
I got a beard.
So David Fox, we're gonna start with you, so you can introduce yourself.
Stop it
Also,
over.
you guys were not in the, I don't know, David, if you were in the room, but I was saying we have about 15 people. And so this, or sorry, 15 minutes per person. So this is your 5-minute warning. And so just to, so if you see me waving that at you, that's why. Okay.
And you may want to see sometimes to me, so. Is this working okay, people here?
Try this one. I think you have to be.
Yeah, that is.
You know,
Less-
I'm gonna be
doesn't feel
really
like
brief,
it's
you know,
sticking. How's this one?
Better.
Okay, well, introduce myself, David Fox, with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Marine Resources Program. And I was involved pretty heavily in this process back when this went on. So Andy asked me to talk a little bit about, kind of recap how we applied natural resource information to Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan to kind of wind up with those final maps and those final review standards. And so what I'm going to try to touch on today is first just mention the parts of Part 5 where these ecological information was applied. Talk about how we developed our spatial and natural resource data. I'll also touch a little bit on fisheries data, but this talk is really more focused on the natural resource data. Talk about how we translated spatial data into the plan policies and the maps and the recommendations, and then touch on the natural resource protection standards. And I will say some of this is going to be a little bit redundant with Andy's talk, but maybe that'll help me go through it a little bit more quickly. So first of all, in Part 5, there's kind of two major areas where natural resource information was applied. The first is the spatial component, which is formally Appendix B in Part 5, which is basically the big map of the area designations that you have, and a number of subsequent maps after that that's ecological resource kind of inventory information. There's also what's called the Special Resources and Uses Review Standards, which is Section B4G of Territorial Sea Plan. Loves these alternating letter number designations, but it's on pages 14 through 19, basically, of the draft that you download from the website. But this black line copy you have, I noticed that the pagination's a little different. I think it starts on page 16 of the black line copy. So I'm going to start with just a really quick overview of the process for incorporating spatial natural resource data into, basically getting to the point where we generate those management area maps. I'll start with that overview, and then I'll talk a little bit more details about how we did each step. So we first gathered and analyzed a number of different data sources for natural resource data. We categorized the territorial sea in accordance to kind of levels of resource importance and kind of levels of need for protection of resources. And Andy talked about that where we had the planning grid and we categorized the territorial sea in that way. We presented recommendations to the Territorial Sea Plan Working Group, public and OPAC at a number of different forums. And these are recommendations that were purely based on ecological information. And then the Territorial Sea Plan Working Group and others consolidated both the ecological data and the fisheries data to eventually come up with these resource maps. And wasn't just purely ecological and fisheries, other information as well. And this looks like a kind of a simple 4-step process, but as Andy pointed out, superimposed on top of this was just numerous public meetings, lots of deliberation within OPAC, within the working group, within subsequent steps. So it wasn't quite as simple as it might look here, but it did follow these kind of general steps. So first of all, we were asked, we as ODF&W really were primarily the agency that was asked to bring together the ecological information that was used in the plan. And our first step was to kind of get guidance on, okay, what type of information do we want to include? So we went to goal 19, and which is really the basis for all of this. And goal 19 has some sections that give some some pretty specific guidance on what the priorities are for protection. But if you just quickly kind of read through this, which I'm not going to do, but it's pretty broad. It ends up really encompassing just about every piece of every natural resource habitat or fish or seabirds, things like that. Just about anything you might consider to be important in the marine environment. We also had to figure out what was out there, what can we use, and what characteristics did the data need to have. And first of all, relevant to goal 19. It's also important, since we were doing a plan for the entire territorial sea, we needed to get data that represented, to the degree possible, the entire territorial sea. Which, if you go into studies, and science and marine science, most studies are very site-specific, good information, but not really useful in a spatial planning context when you're really interested in a broad area. So that really limited what we could look at. And then the data sets needed to exist, which it says there. What I mean there is that this process didn't have the time or money to go out and collect new data, so we really had to depend on existing information at the time. And the data had to be available, which many of these data sets came from outside sources, and so the owners of the data had to agree to let us use it in this process. And they had to be in a usable format, so they had to be spatially represented or in a format that we could put them easily in a spatial format. And they had to be collected using scientifically valid methods and allow for some differentiation within the territorial sea. And what I mean there is that if you have a data set that says everything's equal in the territorial sea, that's not really useful in spatial planning, because you need to differentiate everything. You need to have areas of different levels of protection. So basically our steps, we identified the data sets. The data that weren't immediately in a spatial format, we did some analysis, in some cases some modeling to put them in a spatial format. We mapped them in a common framework, and that's that planning grid that Andy mentioned. Throughout this process, we consulted with experts, including fishermen, and we had science workshops. As another step, we needed to identify the kind of relative vulnerability or sensitivity of the resources to potential impacts from ocean energy development. So this is an important step, because not only do we need to identify the resources, but we needed to figure out which ones are more or less vulnerable or sensitive to potential impacts from ocean energy development. And at the time, there were studies going on, there were workshops, there were kind of literature reviews that were pulling together this type of information, so we really relied on that. And then ODF&W, and I just noticed a slight error. It says TESPAC Ecological Subcommittee. That should be Territorial Sea Plant Working Group Ecological Subcommittee. Developed a recommendation for levels of protection based on the ecological resource information. So the data we gathered, we categorized into a few different groups here: habitat data, fish data, seabirds, marine mammals, and some analytical products. Somewhere around 60 layers of data altogether. These were put at the time on a kind of an online GIS tool called Oregon Marine Map, and that tool was available to the public, to OPAC, to anyone that wanted to view or manipulate the data. And as Andy mentioned, those data layers are still available on the Oregon Ocean Info website. So some of the data we collected, it came in various forms. Some of it was already in a nice spatial format, things like rock habitat data or kelp bed data. Some of it was kind of point data with kind of tables of information associated with it, such as seabird nesting colonies. We had to do some manipulation and analysis of that to kind of categorize those as kind of toward levels of importance. Other data sets weren't really immediately usable. For example, there's a lot of fish data collected by NOAA off of Oregon or off the whole West Coast, and those data are really point samples or they're trawl surveys, but they're kind of point information. And we solicited help from the NOAA biogeography branch to do some modeling exercise to bring those data together and to try to develop distributional maps of some metrics about fish, either species richness, as this example shows, or different species distributions. Then again, Territorial Sea Plan Working Group, that should say, Ecological Subcommittee brought all those pieces together and generated 3 levels of protection recommendations, and these levels represented kind of a degree of impact concern for the resources that were present, and those would result in kind of different levels of standards in each one. So the first level was where the most concern was, and those would have the most stringent standards, and the intermediate one, and the lowest ones would have the most basic standards. And I want to emphasize here, and kind of in a few more slides, is when I say the most basic standards, that's still a pretty high bar to pass. So the most basic standards is still no significant impact on the resources of concern. And just quickly, when we say impact concern, that's really it's not really a single thing. It's based on a kind of combining information about resource abundance, diversity, ecological importance, fishery importance, and then vulnerability and sensitivity to impact.